Okay, so let's talk about how to solve quadratic equations by factoring. I've got the steps over here to the right. The first thing you're going to do is get everything on the same side. The second thing you'll do is to factor. Third, you're going to use something called the zero product property, which we'll talk about in a second. And then fourth, you're going to solve for x. So let's look at this first example. So I want to solve this problem for x. So I'm going to get everything on the same side. And then I want to factor. So I want two numbers that multiply to give me -5, add to give me -4. Those numbers will be -5 and +1. And since the x squared just has a coefficient of 1, I can use the shortcut trick and basically drop those two numbers in with x's. And now I'm going to use the zero product property. And the zero product property is a pretty simple little property. It basically says, 0 ZPP, if you have two numbers, a times b, and they equal 0, then a equals 0 and or b equals 0. So basically, if you have a multiplication of two numbers and the product is 0, one of them has to be 0 or both of them have to be 0. So once I've factored, I've got this thing times this thing equals 0. So that means that one of the two things must equal 0. That's using the zero product property. It's basically taking each of the factors once it equals 0 and set them each equal to 0. And now we're going to solve for x. So I'm going to add 5 to both sides and add -1 to both sides. So this problem has two answers, which means it would have two x-intercepts if I were to graph the associated function. So let's look at the one right below it. So I'm going to get everything on the same side. It's already there. I want two numbers that multiply to give me -18 and add to give me -7. And those two numbers would be -9 and +2. And then you can use either the grouping method or the box method or the magic method, as we talked about before. I'm going to use the box. So I put 3x squared here and -6 here, my two numbers that I got with x's next to them. I'm going to pull out the common factor in the top row. Common factor between 3 and -3, and between x squared and x is x. So if this is 3x and this is 3x squared, this has to be x. If this is x and this is 2x, this has to be 2. If this is 2 and this is -6, this has to be -3. And I can check this, that it's 3x and -3. Here it is. So my factored form is 3x plus 2 times x minus 3, and that equals 0. So now I can use the zero product property. And then I would have to subtract 2 from both sides and divide by 3. Be careful that you don't flip this because that's a really common error. And then x equals 3. So this would also have two x-intercepts if I were to graph it. Let's look at the last problem here. So get everything on the same side. Now, there's a real temptation when you have a problem that looks like this to divide both sides by x. Please don't do it, because if you do, you're going to lose a solution. Okay? So got everything on the same side. I'm going to factor. Now, you may look at this and go, well, what do I have two numbers that, what? Please remember the first step in factoring is to make sure you pull out any common factors. And both of these terms have a common factor. It's x. So if I pull that out, I'm left with a 2x minus 5, basically undistributing. That's not factored. So now I can use the zero product property. X is 0 is one of my answers. X is 5 halves is the other. If you had divided both sides by x at the beginning, you would have lost this solution, x equals 0, and you only would have found 1, so you'd only have half the problem right. So here's the steps again. Get everything on the same side so it equals 0. Factor your result. Use the zero product property by setting each of the factors equal to 0, and then solve for x.